The wind, a bitter, relentless scavenger, howled through the skeletal remains of what was once a European forest. It was December 1944. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate last gasp, had shattered the quiet of winter, replacing it with the sound of grinding metal, shell bursts, and now an eerie, deceptive silence. The snow was no longer pristine white. It was stained, churned into a gray, frozen paste that swallowed the dead and muffled the living. This was the theater of the unexpected, a place where strategy dissolved into sheer, brutal survival. The official designation was the Battle of the Bulge, a massive, calculated gamble by the Wehrmacht to split the Allied line, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. For the men on the ground, however, it was simply known as hell, measured in frostbite and the constant nagging fear of a hidden ambush. American logistics, stretched thin and complacent after the rapid advance across France, were caught completely off guard. The German surge was fast, brutal, and utterly ruthless. Our focus narrows to the remnants of a small, unnamed American reconnaissance unit, cut off from their main division, now navigating the treacherous, bombed-out landscape near a town the maps called Malmedy. The men were exhausted, their rations thin, their morale held together by nothing more than the cold steel of their M1 Garands and the bond of shared suffering. Corporal Thomas "Tommy" Rourke, a tall, gaunt mechanic from Detroit thrust into the role of squad leader, kept his gaze fixed on the broken tree line. He was hardened by weeks of combat, yet beneath the grime and fatigue lay the lingering naivety of a man who still believed there were limits to human cruelty. The irony of this offensive, the central thesis of our story, lay in its moral cost. Hitler's desperate gambit was not just a military failure waiting to happen. It was a psychological grenade thrown at the very idea of Western civilization. The fighting, already savage, had devolved into massacres, reprisals, and a blurring of the lines between soldier and atrocity. The SS, tasked with the vanguard of the offensive, left a trail of murdered prisoners and terrified civilians, their brand of warfare a terrifying blend of tactical necessity and nihilistic fury. Rourke and his 4 remaining men stumbled upon a bombed-out farmstead, a ruin of brick and shattered timber, where the air was thick with the smell of smoke and something metallic, something vaguely human. The only sound was the incessant crook of their boots on the icy ground and the labored breathing of a cold engine idling nearby, a captured, barely functional German Kübelwagen they were using for transport. The place felt wrong, abandoned, too quiet. A veteran soldier learns to dread silence more than noise. Silence usually means you've already been seen. As they cleared the main yard, a pile of refuse drew Rourke's eye. It was a cluster of belongings hastily discarded by fleeing civilians, or perhaps looted by retreating troops. Among the tattered clothes, broken pottery and spent ordnance, sat a large, roughly sewn canvas sack. It looked like a bag meant for potatoes or grain, tied tightly at the top with coarse twine. It was the last thing you would expect to see move. Yet, as Rourke approached, a subtle, almost imperceptible twitch betrayed its contents. Curiosity, or perhaps a premonition, superseded caution. The war had shown him objects in motion often hid a threat. He stopped, his rifle raised. "Hold it," he whispered, his breath clouding the frozen air. "What the hell is that?" The other men fanned out, their eyes scanning the windows of the ruined barn for any sign of a sniper. The tension was a palpable, icy cloak. Then, from the silent sack, a tiny, almost impossible sound pierced the dread. It wasn't a cry of pain or a shriek of terror. It was a soft, choked whimper, a sound too small for the scale of this colossal war. The profound question of the next few seconds hung heavy. In the relentless machinery of war, what do you owe to a life that may be your enemy's, and which has been explicitly designated as disposable? Rourke took a deep, shaky breath, the acrid smell of burnt wood filling his lungs. This sack, this unexpected object in the refuse, was about to test the very definition of what they were fighting for. This was not a German tank, nor an SS machine gun nest. This was something far more dangerous to their souls. This single, small sound is a call to action not just for Tommy Rourke, but for us. It demands we look closer at the true cost of this conflict. If you want to continue this journey into the moral shadows of the Second World War, subscribe now and ring the notification bell to ensure you don't miss the next chapter. Rourke lowered his rifle just a fraction, the heavy metal cold against his glove. The tiny whimper repeated, closer this time, and then a series of muffled, panicked movements within the sack. The possibility of a booby trap, a common and grim tactic in this sector, was still dominant in their minds. German ingenuity in weaponizing the seemingly innocent was legendary. They had been warned relentlessly, trust nothing. "It could be a tripwire, Tommy," muttered Private Miller, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "A screaming Mimi mine. We saw what they did near Stavelot." But the sound was too fragile, too organic, to be ordnance. It was a life sign, faint but unmistakable. Rourke knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, the crunch of the frozen ground amplifying the suspense. The twine securing the neck of the sack was tied in a crude, desperate knot, clearly not the work of a seasoned soldier. Using his combat knife, Rourke carefully sawed through the binding. The thick canvas suddenly gaped open. The sight within was a gut punch, shattering the cold, professional detachment they had maintained for months. Inside the rough sack, wrapped in a threadbare civilian shawl, lay a baby. Small, perhaps no more than a few months old, its face pale and pinched with cold, its eyes wide and swimming in fear. This was a German child, abandoned like trash on the periphery of a war it had no part in starting, nor understanding. The silence that followed was louder than any artillery barrage. For the American soldiers, men who had faced down panzers and experienced the terror of the relentless MG-42, this was the moment the war stopped being a grand, strategic struggle between nations and became a horrifying moral equation. The irony was immediate. They were risking their lives to destroy the Reich, but standing before them was the Reich's ultimate vulnerable future, left to die by its own people. The child, shivering and tear-stained, let out another tiny, guttural sound. And then, a word, a single universal sound, choked out in its native tongue. Mama. It was not the word itself that froze the men, but the sheer raw humanity it represented. It confirmed the baby was not a weapon, but a victim, a casualty of a moral collapse they were now bearing witness to. The question now changed from, "Is it a trap?" to, "What kind of mind could do this?" This scene forces us to address the logistical and moral horror of the German retreat and internal collapse. By late 1944, life in the occupied zones and the crumbling Reich was defined by scarcity and desperation. Food was rationed to starvation levels. The constant Allied bombing raids, which we will detail later, made life underground the norm. For a civilian to abandon a child, the circumstances must have transcended mere hardship. They spoke of absolute, terrifying exigency, a choice made in the shadow of imminent death or overwhelming strategic flight. Rourke gently lifted the child, the weight of the tiny body surprisingly light in his armored arms. The baby's skin was cold, almost blue. A few more hours in the freezing Ardennes air, and it would have been over. For Rourke, a man who had left a pregnant wife in Detroit, the sight was a mirror reflecting his deepest fears and responsibilities. The strategic imperative to get back to the main line, report German positions, and avoid detection, clashed violently with the human imperative now cradled in Rourke's arms. The presence of the child instantly transformed the reconnaissance mission into a rescue operation. This decision was not one of tactics, but of character. Taking the child meant slowing down, increasing the risk of detection, and possibly condemning the entire squad. Leaving it, however, meant surrendering a piece of their own humanity to the brutal calculus of the battlefield. "We can't take it, Sarge," whispered Private Miller, his face a mask of pragmatic dread. "It'll cry. We're behind the lines. It's a risk we can't afford." "We can't leave it," Rourke stated, his voice low and final, pulling his heavy combat jacket around the child. "This ain't what we came here for. We move. Now." The irony deepens. The American soldiers, officially designated as invaders and liberators, were now the reluctant, temporary guardians of the children of their enemy. This infant, a silent, helpless package of German flesh, was now their most critical and most dangerous piece of intelligence. They strapped the child into the Kübelwagen, a German vehicle, now commandeered by American soldiers, carrying an innocent German life. The journey back through the enemy lines was no longer just about survival. It was a desperate race against the clock and the chilling cold to save a life that, by the logic of war, should have been allowed to expire. The Kübelwagen, a lightweight utility vehicle designed for the relatively smooth roads of Western Europe, but now grinding across frozen, shattered farm tracks, sputtered to life. The American unit, now 5 men and 1 fragile infant, was moving deeper into the pocket of the German counteroffensive, a territory swarming with enemy patrols and SS detachments. To understand the psychological forces at play here, we must shift perspective and examine the mindset of the German soldier in the late stages of 1944. The Ardennes offensive was largely spearheaded by hardened veterans and fanatic ideologues, many transferred from the brutal, attritional grinder of the Eastern Front, the Ostfront. The experience there had stripped away any lingering sense of chivalry or conventional warfare ethics. The fighting against the Red Army was total war, a campaign waged not for territory, but for the very existence of 2 opposed ideologies, marked by unparalleled cruelty on both sides. German soldiers returning from the East were psychologically scarred, their moral compasses destroyed. They had witnessed, and often participated in, the systematic destruction of entire villages and the execution of partisan fighters and commissars. For them, life, especially civilian life, held little sanctity. The irony here is profound. The brutality and casual disposal of life required to abandon a child in a sack was a direct psychological consequence of the Eastern Front's inhumanity. The person who left the baby was likely a civilian or a fleeing soldier who had internalized the Reich's dehumanizing logic. In their mind, an abandoned baby was simply another casualty number, another piece of refuse in the rubble of their crumbling world. Rourke's Kübelwagen, blending imperfectly with the surrounding chaos, passed the wreckage of a German supply column, destroyed, they correctly surmised, by a recent P-47 Thunderbolt strike, a weapon we will dissect in detail later. They were deep within the German security perimeter. Their survival depended on a delicate balance, appearing innocuous enough to be dismissed by an enemy patrol, yet constantly vigilant. The baby, miraculously, remained mostly silent, exhausted by cold and trauma. Rourke, holding the wheel with one hand, used the other to keep the child secured inside his jacket. His mind, however, was in a constant loop of strategic paranoia. Every mile was a risk. The temperature had dropped further, plummeting the mercury towards 10 degrees below 0 Celsius. The mechanics of survival for the infant were now paramount. They needed heat, formula, and medical attention, none of which were available on the front line. The first major confrontation arose abruptly. Rounding a bend in the road, they came face to face with a lone German half-track, a Stieg Kfz. 251, a formidable armored transport carrying a squad of 9 grenadiers, its mounted MG-34 heavy machine gun pointed directly at them. The Americans froze. Rourke had mere seconds to decide. The Kübelwagen was a lightweight target. Their 5 M1 Garands were no match for the half-track's armor and firepower. "They're not stopping," Miller hissed, gripping his weapon. "They think we're their own boys." This was a classic battlefield gamble based on uniforms and equipment. The captured Kübelwagen was their saving grace. Rourke, remembering a phrase he'd overheard from a German prisoner, yelled the only word he could recall, loud and sharp. "Raus! Schnell! Out! Quickly!" The grenadiers in the half-track, cold and eager to move, barely glanced at the small, crowded vehicle. They were focused on the front, expecting Allied resistance, not logistical traffic behind the lines. They waved Rourke's car through, their expressions registering only impatience. Rourke drove past, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the ribs of the silent infant. The tension was so thick it was physically painful. They had passed through a potential firing line, saved only by the Germans' strategic overconfidence and the sheer invisibility of a lone logistical vehicle in the chaos. This close call forced Rourke to take drastic measures. The direct route was too dangerous. They had to abandon the main road and rely on the dense, bombed-out forest trails, a gamble that risked bogging down the vehicle but promised better concealment. The decision was final. The life in the sack was more important than the speed of the escape. They were, perhaps unwittingly, embracing the purest irony of the war. They had risked their lives and the success of their vital reconnaissance for a single, small life, the ultimate symbol of the enemy they were ordered to destroy. As Rourke's team steered the Kübelwagen deep into the forested trails, their mission transitioned from mere evasion to a calculated effort to rejoin the Allied lines using the cover of tactical air support. To understand their hope, we must look up, to the sky above the bulge, and examine the technological engine of Allied air power, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47, known to its pilots affectionately as the Jug, due to its massive, barrel-shaped fuselage, was a marvel of American industrial might and engineering over design. Initially, it was treated with some derision by pilots accustomed to the sleek Spitfires or the agile P-51 Mustang. It was heavy, a beast of an aircraft, weighing in at nearly 8 tons fully loaded. The early irony of the P-47 was that it was often dismissed as a flying tank, too big, too slow to climb, and too clumsy for high-altitude dogfighting. However, the P-47's very bulk concealed its greatest strengths, which became brutally evident in the close air support role over Europe. Technology and resilience. The Jug was powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a supercharged radial monster generating over 2,000 horsepower. Crucially, its size allowed engineers to place heavy armor plating around the pilot and critical systems, and, most importantly, it carried 8 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, each firing the devastating 12 7mm round. The sheer volume of fire was unmatched, earning it the nickname the Chainsaw. The irony of survival. The P-47 could absorb damage that would instantly destroy a less robust fighter. Pilots reported returning with holes you could put your head through. It was this resilience that turned the early derision into grudging respect, and then terror in the hearts of its enemy. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe, the once feared air force of the Reich, was a ghost of its former self. Their elite corps of experienced pilots, the Experten, had been systematically decimated by the relentless, overwhelming production of American aircraft. The statistics are staggering. While the Allies were producing thousands of P-51s and P-47s per month, the German replacement rate could not keep pace. Fuel was critically short, and the quality of new pilots was dangerously low. A German pilot's perspective. A fictionalized but historically accurate composite of Luftwaffe pilot accounts reveals the shift in dread. A young German pilot, flying a nimble Bf-109G with a speed advantage at lower altitudes, might have initially scoffed at the Jug's bulk, but that scoff quickly turned to terror. The Jug didn't bleed out and crash after a few hits. It simply kept coming, unleashing a torrent of high-explosive ammunition. The German phrase for facing the P-47, which was quickly disseminated among ground troops, was "Achtung, der Kessel kommt." Attention, the cauldron is coming, a reference to the devastating fire and shrapnel it delivered. Rourke knew that once the dense winter weather broke, the P-47s would own the sky, primarily flying the dangerous ground attack missions, known as Jabos. Their mission was to search and destroy anything moving, including Rourke's German-marked Kübelwagen. The very force of Allied air superiority that offered salvation also presented an acute danger of friendly fire. As they skirted a hillside, they spotted the unmistakable contrails of 3 aircraft high above. They were too far to identify, but the anxiety mounted. Rourke had to find the exact boundary between the German and American lines, the seam, and cross it before the Luftwaffe, in a final, desperate move, could launch its own ground attack aircraft, the FW-190F series, or before a patrolling Jug mistook them for a German logistics vehicle. The baby, miraculously, was still quiet, now swaddled more securely in Rourke's field jacket. The warmth and protection seemed to have stabilized it. Rourke and his men were now driven by a dual objective: deliver the reconnaissance data and deliver this tiny, human artifact of the war's moral decay. The success of the second objective, the salvation of one German child, had strangely become more important to the men than the success of the first. It was the only way to feel like they were still fighting for something pure. The Americans' slow, painstaking journey through the maze of the Ardennes exposed them to the full, devastating reality of industrial warfare. For every single German life they encountered, they were reminded of the sheer, overwhelming might of the American wartime machine. This chapter is about the numbers, the scale of production that made the Allied victory inevitable, and in a profound historical irony, contributed to the desperation that caused the German child's abandonment. The genius of American victory was less about any single invention and more about the logistics and the terrifying scale of production. While German engineering focused on complexity, crafting small numbers of exceptional, intricate, and often over-designed weapons like the Tiger II tank or the Me-262 jet fighter, the American approach prioritized speed, volume, and reliability. Take the engine of the P-47, the R-2800 Double Wasp. This was not an isolated component. It was a production line phenomenon. By the end of the war, the U.S. had produced over 280,000 of these engines, each one a testament to the fact that the war would be won not by genius designers, but by anonymous factory workers. The quantitative edge. While Germany struggled to replace losses, facing constant strategic bombing that targeted oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, and infrastructure, the Allied output was a relentless flood. Over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts were eventually manufactured, dwarfing the production numbers of any comparable German fighter. For every Allied plane shot down, 3 or 4 replacements were already rolling off the assembly line. This quantitative advantage was the true terror weapon of the Allies. Now let us examine the perspective of a German engineer, such as the fictionalized but historically representative Dr. Klaus Richter, tasked with optimizing production under the Allied air siege. Richter faced a soul-crushing paradox. His team could design the world's most advanced fighter, perhaps a Ta-152, but the sheer impossibility of fueling it, protecting the assembly lines, and finding experienced pilots to fly it rendered his genius irrelevant. Dr. Richter's report, composite based on historical records. The Americans are not fighting a war. They are waging an economic catastrophe upon us. Their production numbers are astronomical. We design precision. They design volume. We produce a handful of exquisite engines. They produce thousands of reliable, brutal engines. The industrial capacity of Detroit and Wichita is a strategic asset greater than any division we field. It is a war we cannot win because we cannot produce. This industrial breakdown had direct consequences for the soldiers Rourke's team was evading. German logistics were in shambles, fuel was scarce, spare parts were scavenged from the wrecks of friendly vehicles. The soldiers were poorly fed, often surviving on the bare minimum or by looting. This lack of logistical support, the direct result of the Allied production machine, fostered an environment of desperation among German civilians and military alike. It is this context that frames the terrible decision to abandon the baby. The parents were likely fleeing the total collapse, possibly bombing raids or the advance of another army, and the baby became a logistical burden, a risk to their own survival. In their minds, dominated by the Reich's propaganda of Endsieg, final victory, now collapsing into desperate defeat, the life of a child was a disposable entity when weighed against their own immediate escape. Rourke and his squad, meanwhile, were operating on scavenged German fuel, but they had the confidence that behind them stood a logistical army that could supply everything from a can of K rations to a full replacement aircraft. This confidence fueled their audacity. They knew, even if they were cut off, their side would eventually win. Suddenly the Kübelwagen, running low on fuel and rattling violently, suffered a catastrophic failure. A frozen piston, or perhaps a compromised fuel line, damaged by a shell near the farm, gave out with a jarring thunk. The vehicle coasted to a halt in a secluded, snow-filled hollow, dangerously close to a main German supply road. Their technology, the captured vehicle, had failed them. Now, it was just the men, their weapons, and the desperate, silent, human cargo. The breakdown of the Kubelwagen transformed the situation from a tense drive to a high-risk waiting game. Rourke quickly ordered his men to camouflage the vehicle with snow and broken branches, the silence of the engine now replaced by the labored sound of their frantic shoveling. They were exposed, static, and dangerously close to a German highway. The baby, startled by the sudden mechanical failure and the cessation of the engine's rumble, began to cry, not the soft whimper from the sack, but a stronger, more sustained wail. The sound, amplified by the silent, frozen landscape, was a catastrophic security breach. "Shut it up, Tommy. God, shut it up," Miller pleaded, his voice tight with panic. He was not a callous man, but the sound was a beacon drawing enemy attention in a life-or-death situation. Rourke, desperate, tried everything, bouncing the baby, whispering, wrapping it tighter, but the child was cold, hungry, and in distress. The irony of the situation reached a new pitch. They had risked their lives and mission for this child, and now the child was about to condemn them. The sound of tracked vehicles approaching confirmed their deepest fears. A full German patrol, likely a unit of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, known for their fanatical commitment and lack of quarter, was moving along the nearby road. Rourke, in a flash of strategic inspiration born of desperation, made a radical decision. He knew the patrol would hear the cry. Hiding was impossible. They had to lean into the deception. "Miller, take the German jacket. Put it on," Rourke ordered, pointing to a captured Feldgrau parka they had scavenged. "You and Smith, stay here. If they stop, you're deserters. Caught you. You're taking this refuse to the rear command. Understand? Tell them the SS found it near a burning village. This plan was pure theater. It hinged on the German patrol's assumption that the baby, its cry now fading into tired whimpers, was a minor logistical nuisance, an administrative problem to be quickly dismissed. It relied on the SS's inherent belief that the Americans would never be so foolish as to risk themselves for a German infant. The patrol materialized through the trees. A squat Stug 3 assault gun, formidable and menacing, followed by 2 trucks filled with SS men in white camouflage. The Stug, designed as a highly effective tank destroyer, was the last thing Rourke wanted to face. The Stug halted. An SS officer, rigid and cold-eyed, approached. He spoke in rapid, clipped German, but the tone was universally hostile. Rourke, still holding the baby, tried his best to appear confused, exhausted, and, crucially, German. He pointed to the ruined Kubelwagen and gestured vaguely towards the cry, using the few German words he knew. Kaputt, baby, Malmedy. Broken, baby, Malmedy. The officer's gaze fell upon the bundle in Rourke's arms. For a terrible, elongated moment, Rourke waited for the officer to see past the grime and the confusion, to recognize the American boots and the subtle difference in their helmets. The officer, however, exhibited a flicker of sheer, visible contempt, not for the American soldiers whom he had not recognized, but for the situation, a crying baby, a logistical mess, another sign of the collapsing Heimatfront, home front, intruding on his military mission. His response was a curt, single word, dismissive and chilling, "Feuer! Fire!" referring to the broken car. Then, with a wave of his hand towards the south, he commanded Rourke and his deserters to take the baby and move to the rear, away from his combat zone. He did not care about the origin of the baby, only that it be removed from his sight. He was too consumed by the strategic objective to waste energy on a humanitarian problem. The irony was now complete. The officer of the most fanatical unit in the Wehrmacht, a division notorious for atrocities, had just inadvertently spared the lives of 5 American soldiers and, more importantly, the life of a German baby, simply because he was too tactically focused, too arrogant, and too morally detached to care about a civilian distraction. As the Stug's powerful diesel engine roared back to life, the SS officer ordered the Kubelwagen to be set ablaze, destroying the evidence of the American team's infiltration and simultaneously giving them temporary cover as deserters fleeing a burning vehicle. The Americans, now on foot and carrying a vulnerable life, had survived the most dangerous encounter of their mission. The fire from the burning Kübelwagen provided the American team with an hour of false security before they had to abandon its warmth. They were now moving entirely on foot, their progress agonizingly slow. The baby was showing clear signs of severe hypothermia. Its skin was mottled and its breathing was shallow. Rourke knew their time had run out. They had to cross the line or the infant would die, and their mission, both military and moral, would fail. The target was the seam, the thin, barely held line between the German advance and the hastily reinforced American defenses near Bastogne. The area was a confusing, chaotic mess of patrols, forward observers, and desperate, pitched skirmishes. It was a no-man's land where a soldier's life could be extinguished by a stray bullet, a hidden mine, or the chilling flash of a mortar. The climax arrived at dawn. The snow had stopped, and the clouds had lifted, a break in the weather that was a tactical game-changer. High above, the drone of the P-47 Thunderbolts was heard. This was the moment of salvation, but also the moment of ultimate danger. The Jugs, now airborne, would be attacking any movement, their pilots trained to ignore the color of the paint and focus on the shape of the target. Rourke's team was navigating a shallow, frozen stream bed, the only path offering adequate cover. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a hidden German observation post, a small bunker manned by 2 artillery spotters, likely directing fire against the main American defensive lines. They were distracted, intent on their maps and their field phone. This was the final, defining combat moment. Rourke, without hesitation, ordered the attack. The Americans, using the superior firepower of their M1 Garands and the element of surprise, neutralized the post swiftly. The action was brutal, close quarters, and necessary. They had the location data for the artillery spotters, the crucial intelligence. But they were now trapped between the sounds of the approaching P-47s and the inevitable German counter-reaction. As the roar of the radial engines grew deafening, Rourke signaled to his men. They began waving a large white cloth, a shirt torn from a dead German soldier, knowing it was a desperate gamble that a patrolling Jabo would see it and identify them as friendly troops. Then the ground attack began. Not on them, but on a German column approximately 800 meters away. The P-47 attack. The sound was a physical entity. The Jugs came in low, engines screaming, opening up with their terrifying torrent of 8 50 caliber machine guns. The rounds tore into the German trucks and troops, followed by the terrifying, distinctive whoosh of air-to-ground rockets. This was the overwhelming, inevitable force of American industrial might, brought to bear. The sight of the attack, the explosions, the smoke, the chaos, created the perfect window. The German forces were now entirely focused on the sky, not on the ground at their immediate front. Rourke, cradling the baby, ran. He ran towards the sound of the M1 Garands and the defensive fire coming from the American positions, shouting their code words and identification. He didn't stop until he collapsed into a trench, surrounded by confused, snow-covered American infantrymen. He pushed the intelligence documents into a stunned lieutenant's hands, and then, slowly, carefully, placed the tiny, silent bundle into the arms of the American medic who rushed forward. The baby, delivered across enemy lines by the very soldiers fighting the German army, had completed its journey. The objective was complete. The intelligence delivered, the men safe, and the symbol of their shared humanity preserved. The moral imperative had proven stronger than the strategic logic of the war. The story of the silent sack and the soldiers who chose humanity over expediency is not unique. Thousands of untold stories lie buried beneath the statistics of war. If this story resonated with you, hit the subscribe button and join our community as we continue to unearth the true human drama of history. The immediate aftermath was a blur of tactical confusion, debriefings, and emergency care. The intelligence Rourke delivered was immediately used to neutralize the German artillery observers, contributing to the stabilization of the line around Bastogne, a critical, if localized, success. The baby was rushed to a field hospital, where it was treated for hypothermia and severe malnutrition. It survived. The story of the silent sack quickly became an anecdotal legend among the rear echelon troops, a bizarre counter-narrative to the prevailing brutality of the Ardennes. The irony and the legacies. The ultimate irony of this event lay not just in the rescue, but in the destiny of the object of that rescue. The child was an orphan of the war, a physical manifestation of the strategic failure and moral collapse of the Third Reich. It was also a living testament to the moral compass that survived the horrors of the conflict among the American soldiers. The very act of saving the child was a silent declaration of the values the Allies claimed to be fighting for. The fate of the child. The baby, identified only by a generic German name assigned by the military hospital, was eventually placed in an orphanage overseen by the Allied military government. Its parents were never found. They likely perished in the chaos of the retreat or the subsequent bombing campaigns. The baby grew up to be a German citizen, a living, breathing result of an American decision that defied the military logic of the moment. The memory of the mama whisper was Rourke's lasting burden and legacy. Rourke's transformation. Corporal Rourke returned to his unit, forever changed. He had faced down SS tanks and artillery, but his deepest battle was the one fought over the conscience in the Ardennes snow. He was a hero not for the German positions he identified, but for the life he risked everything to save. He embodied the arc of transformation, from an anonymous mechanic to a man who understood that morality is the ultimate weapon against totalitarian cynicism. The technological legacy, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the brute industrial force that covered Rourke's escape, continued its devastating work until the end of the war. Its legacy was cemented not as a graceful fighter, but as the relentless hammer of the American factory system, a technological marvel that broke the Luftwaffe and ultimately the Wehrmacht. It remains one of the most effective and durable ground attack aircraft in history. The Second World War is often recounted in massive numbers. Millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks, and billions of rounds of ammunition. But the true story, the story that defines humanity's struggle, is found in the smallest details. It is found in the fear of a young American soldier, the fanaticism of a German SS officer, and the cold logic of an overwhelmed engineer. It is found in the crushing sound of a P-47's engine and the devastating efficiency of a .50 caliber round. But above all, it is found in the sound of a single, tiny, choked whisper, a universally understood call for mama, that emerged from a discarded sack in the silent, frozen landscape of the Ardennes. That whisper did not win the war, but it defined the victory. It proved that even in the utter collapse of civilization, the impulse to protect a single vulnerable life remains the deepest, most resilient code of human conduct. This is the true legacy of the Bulge, a story of strategy, technology, and the indomitable power of a simple, moral choice.